About 5 years ago, when I was around 26, I decided to travel the world. I had just finished college, which left me with debt and struggling to find any job, even ones I was overqualified for. Feeling depressed and lonely in my small town in Washington, I decided to escape by traveling. A friend from high school suggested I try woofing and volunteering to travel cheaply, so I gave it a shot. The way it works is simple. You work about 25 hours a week on a farm, and in return, you get food and a place to stay. The cool thing is that there's a big community of travelers doing the same thing, so it's easy to make new friends. You're surrounded by people from different backgrounds, which is a great chance to step out of your comfort zone. As you work and explore new places, you also get time and space to think about your life and figure things out while experiencing something completely different. 8 months later, I had become an expert at shoveling cow manure. I started in Washington, then moved to Oregon, and finally went down to California. In California, I managed to save some extra money by doing side jobs for cash. With that money, I had to decide where to go next. The thrill of being able to buy a ticket to almost anywhere in the world was overwhelming. Following the advice of my free-spirited volunteering partner, I picked a destination at random. I went to a randomizer website and clicked the country button. It chose Georgia. I had almost no idea where it was or what it was like, but that made it even more exciting and adventurous. The thought of going somewhere so unknown really appealed to me, so I decided to go for it. I bought a ticket and started searching online for a farm in Georgia that could host me while I was there. There weren't many options, and most of the farms were in remote areas without internet access. Even though I sent messages to all of them, only a few replied. One farm did respond. It was on top of a mountain, and the pictures showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a big garden in the back, a family with happy children, grandparents eating dinner, and animals around the yard. The farm seemed nice and welcoming. The description was written in good English, and the work requirements sounded reasonable, so I was excited. After I flew into Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, I followed the directions they sent to find the farm. It wasn't easy. Few people in Georgia speak English, and the roads are in bad shape since many haven't been fixed since the Soviet Union fell. It took me about 20 hours of riding old Soviet buses and taxis, traveling on winding roads and rough paths, to reach the blue pin on my map. The path was a dirt road leading up a steep hill into a national park in the northern part of the country. There was nothing around for miles, just trees and silence. As I climbed the hill, I finally saw the house about half a mile away on an even steeper hill, surrounded by trees. From where I stood, it looked abandoned, overgrown, brown, and gloomy. When I walked past the gate, a man named Giri, not his real name, came up to greet me. He was a short, heavy-set, middle-aged guy with a big smile and a friendly demeanor. He shook my hand and started showing me around in broken English. As he led me through the property, I noticed there was no one else around, just the two of us in the middle of the quiet, empty surroundings. I asked about his wife and kids, but he brushed it off, saying something like, "They're away right now." At this point, I started to feel uneasy. The farm was in bad shape, apple trees and crops were dying, the roof of the small barn had caved in, and the house was full of trash and smelled like mold. It was clear Giri was having a tough time, but I wasn't ready to just turn around and leave in the middle of nowhere without any plans, especially after not sleeping for the past 36 hours. It was evening, and after Giri gave me a good meal and tried his best to chat with me in English, he showed me to my room on the second floor, and I went to sleep. I was so exhausted and stressed that I fell asleep almost immediately. I would have slept for 10 hours if I hadn't been woken up by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something heavy and metallic was being dragged across the wooden floor, echoing through the quiet house. In my groggy, half-asleep state, I listened to the noise for a few minutes, trying to figure out what it was. When the noise stopped, I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. The next morning, Geary, now sober but looking grumpy, asked me to fix some of the windows and doors in the house while he went to a nearby village to get some parts. I started feeling uneasy again. Something didn't feel right. He avoided making eye contact and was vague about his plans. The lack of cell reception and internet made me feel even more isolated. Once Geary was gone, I started looking around the house to get a sense of the place. It became clear that it was barely lived in and felt like one of those abandoned houses. There was broken furniture, old newspapers, photos scattered on the floor, and a shattered mirror. I took out my phone and checked the listing again. The photos didn't match the backyard garden or walls of the house I was in. Geary wasn't in any of them, and it felt like a completely different house. At this point, I was in full-blown panic. I packed my things and started to leave when I noticed 3 men walking up the first hill. With no other paths available, I decided to go behind the house and scramble down the steep hill into the forest. Once I felt a bit safer, I stopped and listened carefully. I could hear the men inside the house, and they were clearly looking for me. Terrified of making any noise, I crouched down and hid behind a thick bush, trying to stay as still as possible. I don't know how long I waited, but their voices and footsteps kept getting closer and more persistent. At some point, I heard the men leave. I counted to a large number to make sure they were gone and then headed back to the house and the path. Once I found it clear, I got out of there. I've never run so fast, but I was still in the middle of nowhere with no cars or public transport. Finally, I reached a paved road and started walking in the direction I remembered coming from. Hours passed, and finally, a car drove by and stopped. If it was a horror movie, this would have been Geary and his friends, but it turned out to be a nice family who gave me a ride to town. The listing for the farm disappeared from the website a few days after I left, and I haven't heard from Geary since. When people hear this story, some laugh and say Geary and his friends were probably just coming over for a chat, but I trust my gut feeling. Something was really off about them. I used to live with my aunt, uncle, and older siblings in a remote area far from other houses. Our home was surrounded by a large pasture with nothing else around. It was the kind of place that felt peaceful during the day but could become eerie at night when the wind swept across the fields, making the tall grass sway like restless waves. On our property, there was an old, abandoned cabin that we owned but never used. It sat at the center of the pasture, its weathered wood gray and splintered, with broken windows that seemed to stare like hollow eyes. Even in broad daylight, the cabin had an unsettling aura, as though it held secrets it didn't want to share. My uncle loved to tell me stories about our land. He had a knack for spinning tales, some funny, some sad, and some downright chilling. He'd often talk about the people who lived there long before us, pioneers, farmers, and their families who tried to carve out a life in the harsh, untamed wilderness. Then one evening, as we sat on the porch and watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, he told me another story. This one was different. It wasn't just a tale, it felt like a warning. The old cabin in the middle of our pasture, he explained, used to belong to a farmer and his young daughter. They lived there alone, the father working tirelessly to keep the farm running. His daughter was only about 6 years old, a sweet, lively child with fair skin, long dark hair, and a laugh that could brighten even the gloomiest day. My uncle's voice grew quieter as he recounted what happened next, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something long buried. One day, while the farmer was using his tractor to harvest crops, a terrible accident occurred. His daughter had been playing nearby, her small footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Absorbed in his work, the farmer didn't notice her until it was too late. He shouted, his voice sharp and panicked, but she didn't hear him. My uncle's words faltered as he described the tragedy, the weight of the moment sinking into the heavy silence around us. Even as a little girl myself, I struggled to comprehend such a horrific event. The idea of a child's life ending so suddenly and senselessly was too much for my young mind to grasp. Perhaps that's why I tried to convince myself it was just a story, a frightening one, yes, but nothing more than a product of my uncle's vivid imagination. My older brother Robert was the kind of person who seemed immune to fear. Tall, strong, and full of bravado, he was the one we all turned to when something went bump in the night. He'd laugh and wave it off, always claiming there was a rational explanation. But even Robert had his limits, as we would soon find out. One weekend, Robert decided to invite a few of his friends over for a camping trip. They thought it would be fun to stay in the old cabin, to clean it up and make use of it for the first time in years. The idea excited them, a little adventure, a chance to prove they weren't afraid of the cabin's spooky reputation. I remember watching them from the window as they trudged across the pasture, carrying sleeping bags and flashlights. They laughed and joked, their voices carrying on the cool evening breeze. They spent the afternoon cleaning the cabin, sweeping away years of dust and cobwebs. By the time they were done, it looked almost inviting, almost. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pasture, they lit a small fire outside and roasted marshmallows, their laughter echoing in the quiet night. From my bedroom window, the cabin's flickering light looked like a distant beacon, both warm and haunting. What happened later that night is something none of us will ever forget. The boys had all settled down to sleep, their laughter replaced by the soft hum of nocturnal insects. Robert, always the night owl, stayed up a little longer, lying on one of the old beds and scrolling through his phone. He said he was just starting to drift off when he heard it, a faint, muffled sound, almost like someone crying. At first, he thought it was one of his friends playing a prank. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more desperate, until it was unmistakably the sobbing of a child. Robert sat up, his heart pounding. He tried to rationalize it, maybe it was an animal, or even the wind. But then he heard something else, a faint scream, high-pitched and filled with anguish. The sound seemed to come from outside, somewhere in the pasture. He felt a chill run down his spine, the kind you get when you know you're not alone. Every instinct told him to wake his friends and leave, but he stayed frozen, listening intently. Then he saw her. At the foot of his bed stood a little girl, her figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the cracked window. She was small, her long dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale face. But it wasn't her presence that terrified him, it was her condition. Her body was covered in deep cuts, the wounds raw and bleeding. Her dress was tattered and stained, clinging to her thin frame. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there, crying softly, the sound twisting Robert's stomach into knots. Panicking, he scrambled out of bed and woke his friends. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. Together, they bolted out of the cabin, their footsteps pounding against the wooden floorboards. When they reached the house, they were pale and shaking, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Robert was crying, something I had never seen before, and it scared me more than anything else. The next morning, after the sun had risen and the safety of daylight returned, I told Robert about the story my uncle had shared with me. His face went ashen as I described the farmer and his daughter, the terrible accident, and the lingering sadness that seemed to haunt the land. The old cabin has since been burned down, reduced to ashes by a fire that no one could explain. Sometimes I wonder if it was an accident or if something, or someone, wanted it gone. Either way, I like to think the farmer's daughter can finally rest in peace. This took place a few years ago when I used to live on a farm. My stepmom was always fascinated with the idea of living off the land, growing our own food, and raising animals. After several failed attempts, we finally found a nice house on a piece of land with an established asparagus farm. Shortly after we settled in, we brought some animals to the farm, like chickens, ducks, and a few rabbits. We let the chickens and ducks roam freely around the property, and for a while, everything was fine. They seemed to enjoy exploring the farm, and we didn't have any problems with it. But after raising our last batch of ducklings, something strange happened. 2 of our 4 adult ducks disappeared without a trace. There were no feathers, no signs of a struggle, just gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. Even though we lived in the countryside, we could still see our neighbors, and at the very back of our property, there was a creek that connected to the state river. For a while, we thought the ducks might have just wandered off. But one evening, as it started to rain, we rushed outside to make sure all the animals were safely in their shelters. As we were checking on the animals, my stepmom and I heard a duck in the woods. We ran across the property, about an acre or so, to see if it was our missing ducks. My dad and brother followed us with guns to help search the woods. While we looked along the tree line, they went off toward the creek and told me to whistle if I spotted anything. I headed up the side of the property, checking behind the old barn to see if I could find any signs of the ducks. The area was quiet, and the woods felt a bit creepy in the fading light. As I made my way back to where we had split up, my stepmom came out of the woods looking concerned. "Just so you know, the creek at the back of our property split off into a small stream that ran up along the side of the land, making it easy for animals to wander off without us noticing." As we were facing the stream, we heard several whistles coming from the woods in front of us. We thought it was my brother, so we started looking for him, trying not to scare any ducks that might be nearby. After about 30 seconds, my dad and brother came running out of the woods from the opposite direction, asking why we were whistling. My stepmom and I were confused and said it wasn't us. We told my dad and brother that we thought the whistling was coming from my brother. We all agreed that none of us had done it, and we were with other people who could confirm where we were. Just to clarify, the whistling came from right in front of us, but there was no sign of anyone there. We didn't see any movement or hear any other sounds, only the whistling, which happened several times. A similar story happened about a week after the whistling incident. I wasn't there, but my brother and sister were. It was around 8 p.m., but since it was summer, it was still light outside. A bad storm was approaching, and my brother and sister were watching the sky get darker and turn gray. They looked toward the back of our yard, about an acre away, and saw a man crouched down, dressed in all white. My brother, being who he is, fired a shot toward the sky after telling him to leave several times and then watched him run away. My sister said she saw the man standing behind the fence post before my brother noticed him. She only told my brother about it when the man moved, and she could clearly see that it was a person. After talking to my sister more about what really happened, she said the man had an unusual glow around him, which is why they noticed him in the dark woods. I'm not sure if this story is connected to the whistling, but my parents definitely didn't want us going into the woods anymore.